Imagine you are seated at the most formally regulated table in the British Empire. Every fork measured to the inch, every glass positioned according to rank, every servant trained to move with military precision, every dish inspected before it ever reached the Queen. The system was designed to prevent disaster. It failed completely. Not because anyone was careless, not because the food was spoiled, not because someone wanted to cause harm. The danger was built directly into the table itself, the wallpaper surrounding the room, the serving dishes carrying the food, the architecture of the palace, the traditions that governed every meal. Each one looked harmless. Each one was slowly poisoning the people who gathered there. Not dramatically, not suddenly, not in a way anyone could see. Meal after meal, course after course, year after year. The most unsettling part is that almost nobody noticed. By 1880, Buckingham Palace represented the peak of civilized dining. It was the center of an empire that controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population. Diplomats, ministers, generals, foreign royalty, and aristocrats sat at these tables believing they were experiencing the safest and most refined meals in existence. In reality, they were participating in one of the most sophisticated health hazards of the Victorian age. The danger was not hidden because anyone wanted it hidden. The danger was hidden because science had only just begun discovering that it existed. Louis Pasteur had already published his work on microorganisms. Joseph Lister was transforming surgery through antiseptic practices. Across Europe, scientists were uncovering invisible mechanisms that caused disease. But knowledge inside laboratories and knowledge inside palace kitchens were separated by an enormous distance. The discoveries existed. The institutions had not caught up. Buckingham Palace continued operating according to traditions that had been established generations earlier. The result was a system functioning at the absolute edge of human understanding, a system capable of creating harm that nobody involved could recognize. Queen Victoria ate under these conditions for more than 60 years. That fact sounds reassuring. It should not. Her survival is actually what makes the story disturbing. Because cumulative damage does not announce itself, it arrives gradually. The body adapts. Symptoms become normal. Discomfort becomes routine. The source becomes invisible. And nowhere was that more true than in the dining rooms of Victorian Britain. The first threat was not on the plate. It was all around it. Victorian society was obsessed with a particular shade of green. A vivid, luxurious color that symbolized wealth, taste, and refinement. The color appeared everywhere. Wallpaper, curtains, carpets, table decorations, flower arrangements, fabric coverings. Entire rooms were designed around it. The pigment responsible for this fashionable color was known as Scheele's green. Its beauty concealed a dangerous reality. The pigment contained arsenic, large amounts of it. Throughout the Victorian period, arsenic-based dyes became incredibly popular because they produced colors that natural materials could not replicate. The green was brighter, richer, more vibrant. Exactly the qualities wealthy households wanted. The problem was that arsenic does not simply remain trapped inside decorative materials forever. Under the right conditions, it can be released into the surrounding environment, and Victorian dining rooms created those conditions perfectly. A formal state dinner could last 2 or 3 hours. Dozens of guests crowded into enclosed spaces. Fireplaces heated the room. Candles added additional warmth. Steam rose from food. Humidity increased steadily throughout the evening. Every factor encouraged the gradual release of arsenic compounds from decorative surfaces. Nobody noticed. How could they? The exposure was not dramatic. Guests did not collapse at the table. They did not suddenly become ill. Instead, symptoms appeared slowly. Persistent headaches, fatigue, digestive complaints, difficulty concentrating, mood changes, physical weakness. Symptoms so vague they could be attributed to almost anything. Victorian physicians often described these conditions using terms like nervous exhaustion or constitutional weakness. The explanations sounded reasonable. The actual cause remained invisible. By the 1870s, warnings had already begun appearing in scientific publications. Chemists raised concerns. Medical journals published reports. Researchers questioned the widespread use of arsenic-based decorations. Some manufacturers even began advertising products specifically marketed as arsenic-free. The information existed. But information does not automatically create change. especially inside large institutions. Buckingham Palace did not rapidly redesign entire rooms because of articles published in medical journals. Decorative decisions moved slowly. Traditions moved even slower. The vivid green remained. The dinners continued. The exposure accumulated. Night after night, year after year. The very decorations chosen to communicate elegance may have been contributing to chronic health problems among the people who spent the most time around them. And that was only the beginning, because even if the room itself had been perfectly safe, another threat was waiting directly on the table. The dishes. Victorian dining required enormous quantities of serving equipment. Formal dinners involved course after course. Sauce boats, covered serving dishes, gravy containers, wine vessels, warming trays, hundreds of pieces working together during a single evening. Silver existed. Gold existed. But using precious metals for every serving piece was impractical even for wealthy households. Instead, another material became common: pewter. Pewter looked elegant. It was affordable. It was durable. It seemed like the perfect solution. Unfortunately, many pewter alloys contained lead, and lead has a habit of finding its way into food, especially when heat and acidity are involved. Victorian cuisine relied heavily on exactly those conditions: rich sauces, wine reductions, vinegar-based preparations, slow-cooked dishes, warm serving temperatures maintained throughout lengthy meals. Every one of those factors increased the possibility of lead entering the food. Not enough to create immediate poisoning, not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to contribute to a growing burden inside the body. A burden that accumulated over decades. Modern medicine recognizes chronic lead exposure as a serious health threat. Victorian medicine did not fully understand it. Acute poisoning was recognized. Workers exposed to large quantities could become obviously ill. But low-level exposure produced a completely different picture. Fatigue, joint pain, digestive problems, cognitive decline, mood disturbances, symptoms that looked remarkably similar to ordinary aging, or gout, or stress, or countless other conditions common among the upper classes. No one looked at the serving dishes. No one suspected the table itself. The irony was extraordinary. The wealthiest diners often faced the highest exposure. The more elaborate the meal, the more formal the service, the more opportunities existed for contamination to occur. Status increased risk. Privilege amplified exposure. The rituals designed to display refinement were creating dangers that nobody at the table had the tools to identify. And while guests admired the beauty of the room around them, another invisible problem was already moving toward the dining hall. It was traveling through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, carried by servants, hidden beneath silver covers, and it would become one of the most overlooked dangers in the entire system. Buckingham Palace kitchens were not located beside the dining rooms. That separation was intentional. The Victorian elite valued distance between service and presentation. Cooking smells, kitchen noise, heat, smoke, and servant activity were considered inappropriate for formal dining spaces. The result was a system built around movement. Food traveled, sometimes a considerable distance. Every course prepared in the kitchen began a journey through corridors, staging areas, and service stations before it ever reached the table. At first glance, this appeared completely reasonable. In reality, it created one of the most dangerous conditions in Victorian dining, not because the food was visibly spoiled, because it spent time in temperatures nobody understood were dangerous. Today, food safety depends heavily on temperature control. Modern kitchens monitor it constantly. Victorian kitchens did not. They could not. The science simply was not there yet. Food was judged according to sight, smell, appearance, taste. If a dish looked acceptable, smelled fresh, and appeared properly prepared, it was considered safe. Those standards had governed kitchens for centuries. The problem was that bacterial contamination does not always announce itself. Food can appear perfect while becoming increasingly dangerous, and Buckingham Palace unknowingly created ideal conditions for that process. A dish left the kitchen hot. It moved through corridors carried by footmen. It waited at service stations. It sat on sideboards. It was presented according to rank. Every minute increased exposure. Every delay reduced temperature. Every stage brought the food closer to conditions where bacterial growth accelerated. Modern food safety identifies a temperature range commonly known as the danger zone. Within that range, microorganisms can multiply rapidly. Victorian cooks had no concept of it. Their concern was presentation, not microbiology. A roast needed to arrive warm. A sauce needed to remain pleasant. A fish course needed to appear elegant. Whether harmful organisms were multiplying inside those dishes was not a question anyone knew to ask. The consequences were not always dramatic. That is what made them difficult to identify. Severe food poisoning attracts attention. Chronic level contamination does not. Digestive discomfort, occasional nausea, stomach cramps, irregular illness, symptoms that could easily be blamed on rich food, or stress, or overeating, or dozens of other explanations. The food itself appeared innocent. The danger remained invisible. By the 1860s and 1870s, scientific understanding was changing rapidly. Louis Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms played a role in disease. Researchers across Europe expanded that knowledge. Joseph Lister transformed surgery using antiseptic principles. The scientific revolution had already begun. But Buckingham Palace kitchens continued operating through methods inherited from previous generations. The cooks were not ignorant. They were highly skilled professionals. Many had spent decades mastering their craft. The problem was that they had been trained in traditions established long before germ theory existed. Their expertise came through apprenticeship, observation, experience, not scientific education. There was no institutional mechanism connecting laboratory discoveries to palace kitchens. Scientists published papers. Household managers organized dinners. The two worlds rarely interacted. A palace physician might treat illness. A cook might prepare food. Neither examined the other's domain. Knowledge existed, but it could not cross the gap between disciplines. And while the scientific world was uncovering invisible threats, the most prestigious dining rooms in Britain continued operating exactly as they always had. Every course moving through those corridors was following a schedule, a routine, a tradition. What nobody realized was that another clock was running alongside it. An invisible one. A biological clock measuring the growth of organisms nobody at the palace could see. The danger looked like proper service. It looked like discipline. It looked like excellence, which made it almost impossible to recognize. Then there was the issue of refrigeration, or rather, the absence of it. Victorian Britain had no mechanical refrigeration. Everything depended on ice, enormous quantities of it, imported from Norway, stored underground, preserved in specially constructed ice houses. For much of the year, the system worked, but it was never reliable. Warm winters reduced harvests. Shipping disruptions delayed deliveries. Storage failures accelerated melting. Supply shortages occurred regularly. When they happened, Buckingham Palace faced a difficult reality. The dinners could not stop. State events could not be postponed because ice supplies were low. Diplomatic schedules continued. Royal obligations remained. Guests still arrived. Meals still had to be served. The kitchen adapted the only way it knew how. It relied on visual inspection. Does the fish look fresh? Does the cream smell acceptable? Does the meat appear normal? If the answer was yes, service continued. Unfortunately, bacterial contamination begins long before visible spoilage appears. Food can become dangerous while still looking completely normal. The line between safe and unsafe often exists beyond human senses. Victorian kitchens had no way to detect that line. Their inspections identified only obvious problems. Everything else passed unnoticed, and because no dramatic catastrophe occurred, the system survived. Again and again, year after year, the absence of disaster created confidence. Confidence reinforced tradition. Tradition prevented change. The cycle repeated endlessly. Meanwhile, another danger was developing at the table itself. Not from contamination, not from poison, from abundance. Formal Buckingham Palace dinner was an extraordinary display of wealth. 14 courses were not unusual. Sometimes even more. The sequence seemed endless. Soup, fish, roasts, entrees, additional roasts, game, vegetables, puddings, desserts, cheese, fruit, ices, coffee, liqueurs. Each course represented status, refinement, hospitality, power. Guests were expected to participate. Refusing repeatedly could appear rude. Skipping entire sections disrupted social expectations. The meal was not simply food, it was performance. And that performance placed enormous demands on the human body. Victorian medicine possessed very little understanding of nutrition, no understanding of vitamins, no understanding of metabolic stress, no framework for evaluating the long-term consequences of repeated overconsumption. The assumption was simple: wealthy food meant healthy food. Abundance meant success. The reality was far more complicated. These meals were rich in meat, rich in fats, rich in sauces, rich in alcohol, yet often surprisingly limited in nutrients modern medicine considers essential. Fresh vegetables played a relatively minor role, fiber intake remained low. Nutritional balance was rarely a priority. Appearance mattered more. Presentation mattered more. Tradition mattered more. Guests left the table satisfied, sometimes overwhelmed. The physical consequences appeared later. Digestive problems, chronic fatigue, inflammation, joint pain, conditions frequently diagnosed as gout. Symptoms so common among the aristocracy that many considered them inevitable, almost normal. But the danger was not any single course. It was not one meal. It was not one evening. It was accumulation. Repeated exposure. Repeated excess. Repeated strain. Night after night. Year after year. And nowhere was that accumulation more visible than among the people who ate at Buckingham Palace most frequently. The courtiers. The household officials. The royal inner circle. The people closest to power. Because the closer you were to the center of the empire, the more often you sat at this table. And the more often you sat at this table, the greater the burden became. By the time anyone noticed the consequences, the damage had already been accumulating for decades. And the most revealing example of all was sitting at the head of the table itself. Queen Victoria.